6 weeks after her procedure, everything went wrong that night. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it buries you alive. The champagne flutes clinked like tiny bells across the banquet hall, each toast another layer of performance, another veil drawn over the rot beneath. Cassandra Moore stood at the center of it all in ivory silk that caught the chandelier light, her smile practiced to perfection, her hand resting in the palm of a man she no longer recognized. Daniel Reed, her fiancé, her future, her carefully constructed exit from a past she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. But 6 weeks ago, everything had changed. 6 weeks ago, she'd sat in a sterile clinic room with fluorescent lights humming overhead, waiting for test results that would determine whether her body had betrayed her. The procedure itself had been simple. A blood draw, a consultation, a prescription she'd filled at a pharmacy 3 towns over where no one knew her name. The doctor had been kind, but clinical, explaining viral loads and treatment protocols with the detachment of someone who delivered this news 5 times a day. "You'll need to inform any partners," the doctor had said, her pen hovering over a prescription pad, past and present. Cassandra had nodded, numb, already calculating the impossible math of her confession. How do you tell your fiancé that the man who would stand beside him at the altar, his best friend since college, his brother in everything but blood, had given you more than just attention during those stolen afternoons last summer? She hadn't told Daniel. Not then. Not in the 6 weeks since. And now, at their engagement party, surrounded by 200 guests who believed in their love story, Cassandra caught Marcus Webb's eyes across the room and felt her chest constrict. He stood near the bar in a tailored navy suit, that same easy smile he'd worn the first time he'd kissed her, the same confidence that had made her believe she was special, chosen, worth the risk. He raised his glass to her, a private toast, a secret acknowledged. The room tilted slightly, or maybe it was just her world shifting off its axis again. It had started innocuously, the way most disasters do, with a text message that should have meant nothing. "Daniel's working late again. Want company?" Marcus had sent it on a Tuesday evening last July, when the Texas heat made the air thick enough to choke on, and Cassandra had been sitting alone in the apartment she shared with Daniel, staring at wedding magazines she couldn't bring herself to open. They'd been engaged for 4 months. She should have been happy. Marcus had brought wine and takeout, and they'd sat on her balcony watching the sunset bleed across the Austin skyline, talking about everything except the wedding. He'd asked about her photography, the career she'd put on hold when she'd moved to be with Daniel. He'd remembered details she'd mentioned once, months ago, at some dinner party where she'd felt invisible beside her successful attorney fiancé. "You light up when you talk about it," Marcus had said, refilling her glass. "I don't see that enough." She should have recognized the pattern, the attentiveness, the way he made her feel seen in a way Daniel hadn't in months, maybe years. But loneliness is a powerful anesthetic, numbing judgment until you wake up in someone else's bed wondering how you got there. The affair had lasted 3 months, 3 months of afternoon meetings in hotels with generic art on the walls, 3 months of text messages deleted as soon as they were read, 3 months of Marcus whispering promises he never intended to keep, that he'd tell Daniel, that they'd figure it out together, that what they had was worth the destruction it would cause. And then, in October, Marcus had simply stopped. No explanation, no confrontation, just a sudden return to the careful distance of Daniel's best friend, as if those 3 months had been a fever dream they'd both agreed to forget. Cassandra had felt relief and devastation in equal measure. She'd convinced herself it was for the best, that she'd been given a second chance to make her relationship work, to become the woman Daniel believed her to be. Then came the procedure. The diagnosis, the viral load that couldn't be ignored, and the realization that Marcus hadn't just taken her trust, he'd taken her health, her future, and left her holding the consequences alone. "You look pale." Daniel's voice pulled her back to the present, his hand warm on her lower back. "Are you feeling all right?" She turned to him, this man who'd proposed on a beach at sunset, who'd cried when she said yes, who still didn't know that the best man he'd chosen had been inside her while he'd been working late on contract negotiations. "Just overwhelmed," she managed, the lie smooth on her tongue now after weeks of practice. happy, overwhelmed. He kissed her forehead, gentle and proprietary, and she felt the weight of her deception like a physical thing, pressing down on her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. Across the room, Marcus was laughing with a group of Daniel's law school friends, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of a blonde woman Cassandra didn't recognize. She watched him, this man who'd held her face between his hands and promised her things he'd never meant, and felt something dark unfurl in her stomach. He'd known. When he'd ended it so abruptly, when he'd retreated without explanation, he'd known he was sick. He'd known, and he'd said nothing, let her find out on her own in that clinic room 6 weeks ago. The rage that swept through her was clean and clarifying, cutting through the fog of shame and confusion she'd been drowning in. She excused herself from Daniel's side, moving through the crowd with purpose, her ivory dress whispering against her legs. Marcus saw her coming, and his smile faltered, just for a moment, before snapping back into place. "The beautiful bride," he said, loud enough for the people around them to hear. "Congratulations again, Cass." She hated how her name sounded in his mouth. Intimate. Familiar. "We need to talk." Her voice was low, meant only for him. Now, something flickered in his eyes, calculation, maybe fear, but he nodded, setting down his drink and following her out of the banquet hall, down a corridor lined with gilt-framed mirrors that reflected their images back in infinite regression. She led him to a small courtyard behind the venue, where string lights cast everything in amber, and the music from the party was muted by distance and closed doors. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Marcus leaned against the stone wall, his casual posture betrayed by the tension in his jaw. "Cassandra, don't." She held up a hand, surprised by how steady it was. "You knew you were positive when you were sleeping with me. You knew, and you didn't tell me. You didn't protect me. You just disappeared." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of traffic and laughter from the party they'd left behind. "I got tested in September," he finally said, his voice flat. "After someone I'd been with before you told me I needed to. By then, we'd already ended things. I hoped maybe you'd be okay." "You hoped?" The word came out sharp, incredulous. "You didn't think to warn me? To give me a chance to get tested before it was too late?" I panicked. He pushed off the wall, taking a step toward her. "I didn't know how to tell you without destroying everything. Your relationship with Daniel, his friendship with me. So you chose yourself." She laughed, a bitter sound that tasted like ash. "You chose to protect yourself and let me find out on my own. Let me sit in that clinic thinking I was going in for routine testing and walk out with a prescription for antiretrovirals." Marcus's face had gone pale, the string lights casting shadows that made him look gaunt, haunted. "I'm sorry. God, Cassandra, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this. You need to tell Daniel." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and final. "No." Marcus shook his head, his composure cracking. "Cassandra, please. You can't tell him. It would destroy him. It would destroy everything. Everything is already destroyed." Her voice rose, echoing off the courtyard walls. "I'm on medication for the rest of my life because of you. Because you were too much of a coward to do the right thing. And now you're asking me to marry Daniel while keeping this secret? To let him stand at that altar with you beside him, not knowing what you did? What we did?" His voice hardened. "You made choices too, Cassandra. You invited me in. You said yes every time." The accusation struck like a physical blow, stealing her breath. He was right, in the worst possible way. She had made choices. She had betrayed Daniel long before she'd discovered the full cost of that betrayal. "Tell him," she said again, quieter now. "Or I will." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A calculation, a decision made. "You won't," he said finally. "Because if you tell him about me, you have to tell him about yourself. About what you did. And you're not ready to lose him." He was right again. The realization sat heavy and sickening in her stomach. Marcus reached out, his hand stopping just short of her arm. "Let's just get through the wedding. After that, we can figure out what to do. But right now, with everyone watching, we need to keep it together." She wanted to argue, to demand justice or confession or some acknowledgement that this situation was untenable. But exhaustion swept over her. 6 weeks of carrying this secret, of pretending everything was fine while her body betrayed her in ways that couldn't be hidden forever. After the wedding, she heard herself say, "But Marcus? If you don't tell him by then, I will." Consequences and all. She left him standing in the courtyard, returning to the party alone, slipping back into her role as the glowing bride-to-be with the ease of someone who'd been playing pretend her entire life. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of dress fittings and seating charts and cake tastings, each day another layer of normalcy painted over the rot beneath. Cassandra moved through it all like an actress in a play, her lines memorized, her marks hit perfectly. Daniel, bless him, noticed nothing. Or perhaps he noticed everything and chose to ignore it, the way people do when confronting the truth would shatter the life they've built. At night, alone in their bed while Daniel slept peacefully beside her, Cassandra would stare at the ceiling and calculate her options. She could tell him. She could confess everything. The affair, the diagnosis, Marcus's knowledge and betrayal. She could burn it all down and maybe, in the ashes, find something resembling integrity. But every time she opened her mouth to form the words, she'd see Daniel's face. Imagine the hurt and betrayal that would replace the love currently written there, and the words would die in her throat. So she said nothing, took her medication, smiled for the photographers, and watched Marcus watch her across rooms, his expression unreadable. 2 days before the wedding, he called her. "Meet me," he said without preamble. "The coffee shop on 6th Street. 1 hour. She should have refused, should have blocked his number, told Daniel everything, let the chips fall where they may. Instead, she went. The coffee shop was crowded with students and freelancers, the hiss of the espresso machine providing cover for conversations that couldn't be overheard. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table, 2 cups in front of him. "I got you a latte," he said as she sat down. "The way you like it." The casual intimacy of the gesture made her want to throw the cup in his face. "What do you want, Marcus?" He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago at the engagement party. There were shadows under his eyes, and his shirt was rumpled in a way that suggested he'd slept in it. "I need you to understand something." He leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not the villain you've made me out to be in your head. I'm sick too. I'm dealing with the same diagnosis, the same fear, the same medication regimen. And I'm doing it alone because I can't tell anyone without destroying my life. That's your choice." She kept her voice flat, refusing to give him the absolution he was clearly seeking. "You could tell people, get support, but you'd rather protect your reputation than do the right thing. And you're so righteous?" His eyes flashed. "You're about to marry my best friend while hiding the same secret. We're both liars, Cassandra. The only difference is I'm honest about it." She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words felt hollow even before she spoke them. "I'm telling him." Her voice was steady, the decision solidifying as she said it out loud. "After the wedding, I'm telling Daniel everything. And if you don't tell him your part, I'll tell him that too." Marcus's hand shot across the table, gripping her wrist hard enough to hurt. "You can't. Cassandra, please. If Daniel finds out, I lose everything. My job, I work at his firm, remember? My reputation in the legal community, everything I've built. You should have thought of that before you had unprotected sex while positive." She pulled her wrist free, rubbing the skin where his fingers had pressed. "This isn't my problem anymore, Marcus. You made your choices. Now live with them." She stood, leaving the untouched latte on the table between them, and walked out into the Austin afternoon heat, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The decision had been made. After the wedding, she'd tell Daniel everything. Let the consequences come. At least she'd be honest. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect Texas morning that seemed designed for celebrations. Cassandra woke early, alone in a hotel room. Tradition dictated she and Daniel spend the night apart, and stared at herself in the mirror, wondering if other brides felt this sense of impending doom, or if that was unique to women about to marry men they'd betrayed. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Don't do this. Please. We need to talk before you make a mistake you can't take back. Marcus." She deleted it without responding. The morning passed in a blur of hair and makeup, her bridesmaids chattering around her with the nervous energy of women who knew something was off but couldn't name it. Her best friend, Rachel, kept shooting her concerned looks in the mirror. "You sure you're okay?" Rachel asked, adjusting Cassandra's veil. "You seem distant. Just nervous. Another lie. Big day." "Yeah." Rachel's reflection smiled, but her eyes remained worried. Big day. The ceremony was set for 4 o'clock, golden hour, in a garden venue with climbing roses and strings of Edison bulbs that would glow like fireflies as dusk fell. By 3:30, Cassandra was dressed, her ivory gown a masterpiece of lace and silk, her face painted into the version of herself she'd been pretending to be for months. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. She looked like a bride with no secrets. A knock on the dressing room door. One of the venue coordinators poked her head in. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Cassandra's stomach dropped. Who? But she already knew. Marcus stood in the hallway outside the dressing room, still in jeans and a t-shirt, his face pale and wild-eyed in a way that sent alarm bells ringing through her head. "What are you doing here?" She kept her voice low, aware of the bridesmaids and family members moving through the rooms around them. "You should be getting ready with Daniel. I need you to listen to me." He grabbed her arm, pulling her into an empty room off the hallway, some kind of storage space filled with extra chairs and flower arrangements. "You can't tell him. Cassandra, I'm begging you. Don't destroy all of our lives because you're feeling guilty." "Guilty?" She yanked her arm free. "Marcus, I have HIV because of you. Because you knew and didn't tell me. This isn't about guilt. This is about justice." "Justice?" He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "You want justice? Fine. Tell Daniel. Watch him leave you. Watch him fire me, ruin my career, make sure everyone in our circle knows what we did. Is that justice?" "Yes." The word came out stronger than she felt. "That's exactly what we deserve." Something in Marcus's expression shifted then, hardening into something she didn't recognize. "Then I guess I need to tell you something." His voice was cold now, clinical. "I've been in treatment for almost a year, Cassandra. Since last March. Do you know what that means?" Her mind raced, calculating dates, implications. "You were positive before we even started, and I told you I was on prep." He smiled, sharp and cruel. "Remember? That conversation we had the first time, when you asked if we needed condoms and I said I was on preventative medication? I wasn't lying. I am on medication, just not the kind that protects you." The room spun, walls closing in, air thinning. "You knew." Her voice came from far away. "From the beginning, you knew, and you deliberately infected me. I gave you a choice." His hands were shaking now, his composure cracking. "You chose to trust me. That's on you." She thought she might vomit, right there in her wedding dress, the white silk suddenly feeling like a shroud. "Why?" It was barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was angry." The confession tumbled out, raw and desperate. "Because Daniel got everything, the career, the girl, the perfect life, and I got nothing. Because misery loves company, Cassandra, and I didn't want to be sick alone. The truth of it, the calculated cruelty, the premeditated destruction, hit her like a physical thing, stealing her breath, her words, her ability to process the enormity of what he'd done. "I'm calling the police." She reached for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. "What you did is assault. It's criminal. You're going to jail." Marcus moved fast, grabbing the phone from her hand, throwing it against the wall where it shattered into pieces. "No one's calling anyone." His voice was calm again, terrifyingly calm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk down that aisle. You're going to marry Daniel. And you're never going to speak about this again. Because if you do, I'll tell everyone that you knew I was positive and didn't care. That you pursued me, seduced me, knowing the risks. Who do you think Daniel will believe? His best friend since college? Or the woman who cheated on him? He'll believe the truth." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure. Marcus stepped closer, his breath hot on her face. "The truth is whatever story sounds most convincing." "And I'm a lawyer, Cassandra. I make my living telling convincing stories." The door burst open then, and Rachel stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, taking in the scene. Cassandra in her wedding dress, Marcus too close, the shattered phone on the floor. "What's going on?" Rachel's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Nothing." Marcus stepped back, his public persona sliding into place like a mask. "Just pre-wedding jitters. I'll leave you ladies to it." He brushed past Rachel, disappearing down the hallway, leaving Cassandra standing in the storage room, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume for a play she could no longer perform. "Cass?" Rachel moved closer, her hand gentle on Cassandra's arm. "What the hell was that?" And just like that, the dam broke. Cassandra told her everything. The affair, the diagnosis, Marcus's confession. All of it came pouring out in a torrent of words and tears, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into rubble at her feet. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to horror to fury as the story unfolded. "We need to call the police," Rachel said when Cassandra finally fell silent. "Right now. What he did is a crime, and we need to tell Daniel. I can't." Cassandra sank onto one of the folding chairs, her dress pooling around her like melted wax. "Rachel, there are 200 people out there waiting for a wedding. Daniel's family, my family, everyone we know. How do I walk out there and tell them it's over? That everything they believed about us was a lie? You just do." Rachel crouched in front of her, taking her hands. "Because the alternative is marrying someone while keeping this secret, and that's not a marriage, that's a prison sentence." She was right. Cassandra knew she was right. But knowing and doing are different continents, separated by an ocean of fear and shame and the desperate desire to be anyone other than who she'd become. "I need time to think. Cass, please." She looked up at her friend, her oldest confidant, the woman who'd known her before Daniel, before Marcus, before everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. "Give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Then we're making a decision. Together, she left Cassandra alone in the storage room, surrounded by flowers and folding chairs and the shattered remains of her phone. Cassandra closed her eyes, trying to imagine walking down that aisle, saying vows she didn't mean to a man she'd betrayed, with Marcus standing beside him holding the rings. She couldn't do it, but she also couldn't imagine standing in front of 200 guests and confessing everything, watching her family's faces as they learned the truth about who she really was. The paralysis was absolute. Total. She sat frozen in her wedding dress, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity. And then she heard the screaming. Later, when the police questioned everyone, they'd try to piece together the exact sequence of events. Someone, a groomsman, maybe, or one of the venue staff, had found Marcus in the parking lot, slumped over the steering wheel of his car, a bottle of pills spilled across the passenger seat. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes, but everyone knew it was futile. You don't come back from that much Ambien and vodka. Daniel found Cassandra still in the storage room, her dress wrinkled now, her makeup ruined by tears. She couldn't remember crying. "He's dead." Daniel's voice was flat with shock. "Marcus is dead. They're saying it was intentional." That he left a note. Cassandra felt the room tilt again, reality fragmenting into pieces that no longer fit together. "What did the note say?" Daniel shook his head. "The police won't tell us. They want to talk to you, though. They said your name was mentioned." Of course it was. Marcus's final act of cruelty or mercy, she couldn't tell which, a confession or an accusation, forever sealed in an envelope she'd never be allowed to read. The wedding was postponed, then quietly canceled. Guests were sent home with apologies and no explanations, and Cassandra sat in a police interview room, a blanket around her shoulders, still in her wedding dress, telling a story that sounded insane even to her own ears. The detective, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a notebook, listened without interrupting, writing occasionally, her expression carefully neutral. "So Mr. Webb assaulted you by knowingly exposing you to HIV," the detective summarized when Cassandra finished. "And when you threatened to expose him, he—" "What?" Killed himself to avoid the consequences? I don't know. And she didn't. Couldn't fathom what had been going through Marcus's mind in those final moments. Maybe he couldn't live with what he'd done. Or maybe he wanted to make sure I'd never tell anyone the truth. We'll need to test the claims, the detective said gently. Medical records, phone records, anything that can corroborate your timeline. Cassandra nodded, numb. Let them investigate. Let them pick apart the wreckage of her life looking for evidence. It didn't matter anymore. The police eventually released her with instructions not to leave town. Daniel drove her back to their apartment in silence, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his profile unreadable in the sodium lights of the highway. Is it true? He finally asked as they sat in the parking lot, neither of them making a move to go inside. All of it? Yes. The word hung between them, small and devastating. How long? 3 months. Last summer. It ended in October, and the HIV? Positive. On medication. The clinical language made it easier, created distance from the enormity of what she was confessing. Daniel's breath came out in a shuddering exhale, and she realized he was crying, silent tears tracking down his face in the dashboard light. I'm sorry. The words felt absurdly inadequate. Daniel, I'm so sorry. Were you ever going to tell me? His voice cracked on the question. Or were you just going to marry me and keep lying? I was going to tell you. After the wedding. I told Marcus that yesterday, and that's why she couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say killed himself because that would make it real, would assign responsibility she wasn't sure she could carry. Get out. Daniel, get out. He wasn't yelling. That would have been easier. Instead, his voice was soft, broken, final. Get out of my car and out of my life. I can't look at you right now. She got out. Stood in the parking lot in her ruined wedding dress as Daniel drove away, his taillights disappearing into the Texas night. The investigation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of medical records subpoenaed, phone records analyzed, friends and family questioned about Marcus Webb's state of mind in the days leading up to his death. The suicide note, when it was finally released to the family, confirmed everything Cassandra had said, the affair, the deliberate infection, his guilt and fear of exposure. It also contained an apology, not to Cassandra, to Daniel. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do to your wedding day. I'm sorry for the man I became. I'm sorry I couldn't be the friend you deserved. No mention of Cassandra. No acknowledgement of the woman whose life he'd systematically destroyed. Just a final act of erasure, reducing her to a supporting character in his tragedy. The district attorney considered posthumous charges. There was precedent for criminal transmission of HIV, but ultimately declined. Marcus was dead. Justice, such as it was, had already been served. Cassandra moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Daniel, finding a studio on the east side of Austin where she could disappear into anonymity. She quit her job, unable to face the questions and sideways glances from coworkers who'd read about the scandal in the local news. Rachel checked on her regularly, bringing groceries and moral support, but even her oldest friend couldn't breach the wall Cassandra had built around herself. The medication kept her viral load undetectable. Her body was healing, at least. Her mind was another matter. At night, she dreamed of the wedding that never happened. Sometimes she made it down the aisle, and when Daniel lifted her veil, it was Marcus's face underneath. Sometimes she stood at the altar and couldn't remember which man she was supposed to be marrying. Sometimes the ceremony proceeded normally, and only afterward did she realize she'd married a corpse. She woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, unable to distinguish memory from nightmare. The therapist she eventually started seeing, a specialist in trauma and PTSD, explained it was normal, this blurring of reality. Her brain was trying to process events that defied normal categorization, and dreams were its way of working through the impossibility. Do you blame yourself? The therapist asked during one session, 3 months after the canceled wedding. Every day. Cassandra's voice was flat, effect dampened by the antidepressants she'd been prescribed. I made choices. I pursued the affair. I trusted Marcus when I should have been more careful. I almost married Daniel while lying to him. How do I not blame myself? And Marcus? Do you blame him? He's dead. What good does blame do? Blame isn't about him anymore. It's about you acknowledging that what he did was wrong, was criminal, regardless of your choices. Cassandra stared at the wall behind the therapist's head, at a painting of a sunset that looked peaceful and false, and tried to access the anger she knew should be there. It wouldn't come. There was only numbness, vast and oceanic, swallowing everything else. 6 months after her canceled wedding, Daniel called. Cassandra stared at his name on her phone screen for 3 rings before answering, her heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" "Hi." His voice sounded older, worn. "I hope it's okay that I called. Rachel gave me your new number. It's fine." She sat down on her second-hand couch, drawing her knees to her chest. "How are you?" "I'm—" He paused, and she could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "I'm not okay. But I'm working on it. Therapy, mostly. Trying to understand everything that happened." "Yeah, me too." Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd lost and everything they'd never been. "I read Marcus's note," Daniel finally said. "The full version, not just the excerpt they released to the press. The police sent it to me last week." Cassandra's throat tightened. "And?" "He wrote about why he did it. Not just the suicide, but everything before, the affair, the infection. He said he'd been in love with you since the day I introduced you, that watching us together made him insane with jealousy, that he'd wanted to punish both of us for having what he couldn't. The confession, posthumous, cowardly, should have brought clarity. Instead, it just added another layer of complexity to a situation already drowning in ambiguity." "Does that make it better or worse?" she asked. "Knowing his motive? I don't know." Daniel's voice cracked. "I keep thinking about all the times he was with us, at dinners and parties and game nights, knowing he'd slept with you. Knowing he'd done something that could destroy you. And he just smiled and poured drinks and pretended to be my friend. I did the same thing," Cassandra reminded him quietly. "I smiled and planned our wedding and pretended I wasn't lying to you every single day. That's why I called." He took a shuddering breath. "I need to know, if he hadn't died, if the wedding had happened, would you have told me?" The question she'd been asking herself for 6 months. "Yes," she said finally. "I was going to tell you after the wedding. I'd decided that morning. That's what I told Marcus when he came to see me before the ceremony, and that's why he did what he did." "Okay." Another long pause. "Thank you for being honest." Finally, "Daniel, I'm so sorry." "Don't." He cut her off, not unkindly. "I can't. I'm not ready for apologies yet. Maybe someday, but not now. I just needed to hear you say that you would have told me, that you hadn't completely lost yourself in the lie." "I hadn't, I promise." "Okay." She heard him exhale, long and slow. "I'm going to go now. But Cassandra, I don't hate you. I want to, but I don't. And I hope you're taking care of yourself." "You too." The line went dead, and Cassandra sat holding her phone, crying for the first time in months. Not the numb, dissociative tears she'd shed in the immediate aftermath, but real, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and long buried. She cried for Daniel, for the love they'd almost had. She cried for herself, for the woman she'd been before Marcus, before the diagnosis, before everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. And she cried for Marcus, despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal and violation. She cried for the man who'd been so consumed by jealousy and self-hatred that he'd destroyed 3 lives trying to fill the void inside himself. When the tears finally stopped, she felt emptied out, hollowed, but also somehow lighter. Maybe this was what healing felt like. Not happiness, not absolution, but the ability to feel something other than numbness. It was a start. The 1-year anniversary of her canceled wedding came and went. Cassandra marked it by taking herself to dinner, a nice restaurant she'd always wanted to try, the kind of place she and Daniel might have gone for an anniversary. She ate alone, drank a glass of wine, watched the other diners with their partners and friends and families, and felt okay. Not happy, Not healed, but okay. Her viral load remained undetectable. Her therapist said she was making progress. She'd started taking photography jobs again. Small things at first, family portraits, senior pictures, building back the career she'd abandoned. Rachel had stuck by her through everything, refusing to let Cassandra disappear entirely into her guilt and isolation. Once a week, they met for coffee, and Rachel would update her on the outside world, the friend group they'd shared that had largely drifted away after the scandal. "People are starting to forget," Rachel said one afternoon, stirring sugar into her latte. "The story's getting less interesting. New scandals, new drama. Good." Cassandra meant it. She was tired of being the protagonist in a tragedy everyone else got to spectate. "Daniel's dating someone," Rachel added carefully, watching Cassandra's face for a reaction. "Sarah Chen, from his firm. She seems nice." Cassandra processed this information, waiting for the stab of jealousy or regret that never came. Good for him. He deserves to be happy. And she meant that too. Some nights she still dreamed of Marcus. Not the nightmares of the early months, but stranger dreams, more ambiguous. Sometimes they were back in that hotel room, and he'd turn to her and say, "I'm sorry," and she'd believe him. Sometimes they were at Daniel's wedding, a different wedding, a future timeline where Marcus hadn't destroyed everything, and they'd catch each other's eyes across the aisle and just know. An acknowledgement, a shared understanding that some debts can never be repaid. She'd wake from these dreams feeling unsettled but not traumatized. Her brain was working through it, her therapist explained, processing the cognitive dissonance of hating someone who'd also been, for a brief window, someone she'd cared about. Complex trauma doesn't resolve neatly, the therapist said. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about him. That doesn't make you weak or wrong. Cassandra was learning to accept that. The multiplicity, the contradiction, the fact that Marcus had been both victim and perpetrator, both broken and cruel, and that those things didn't cancel each other out. She was learning to accept the same about herself. 18 months after the canceled wedding, Cassandra got a call from Marcus's sister. They'd never met. Marcus's family had stayed conspicuously absent from his funeral, their grief and shame too tangled to disentangle. But Emily Webb's voice on the phone was warm, tentative. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," Emily said after introducing herself. I found something while going through Marcus's things, and I thought you should have it." They met at a coffee shop, not the one where Marcus had made his final desperate appeal, but a different one, neutral territory. Emily was younger than Marcus had been, maybe 30, with the same dark eyes but a softness her brother had lacked. She slid an envelope across the table, worn and creased, Cassandra's name written on it in handwriting she recognized. "He wrote it before that day," Emily explained. "I found it in his apartment with instructions to mail it if anything happened to him, but I couldn't bring myself to send it until now. I needed time to understand everything first." Cassandra stared at the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid of what final words Marcus might have left her. "You don't have to read it now," Emily said gently. "Or ever, but I thought you should have the choice." After Emily left, Cassandra sat with the letter for an hour before finally opening it. The handwriting was shaky, written by someone already halfway to the decision that would end his life. "Cassandra, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you already know the worst of what I did. I won't insult you with apologies. They'd be meaningless now, just words to make a dead man feel better about himself. I want you to understand something, though. When I was diagnosed, I felt like my life ended. Everything I'd built, everything I'd planned for, gone in one positive test. I was angry. At the universe. At my body. At every decision that had led me to that clinic room. And then there you were. Beautiful. Kind. Unhappy with Daniel in ways he couldn't see, but I could. And I thought, why should I be the only one suffering? Why should you get to walk away clean? It was cruel. It was unforgivable. I know that. I knew it even as I was doing it. But here's the thing I couldn't tell you while I was alive, after it was done, after I'd infected you and ended things and watched you marry Daniel while carrying my secret, I realized I'd done the one thing I'd been trying to avoid. I'd ensured I'd always be alone in this. Because you'd never forgive me. and you'd never understand, and I'd never have anyone who knew the full truth of who I'd become. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that what I did to you destroyed me more thoroughly than the virus ever could. And that's not your burden to carry. That's mine. I hope someday you find peace. I hope you find someone who loves you better than Daniel did, better than I could have. I hope you forget me, except as a cautionary tale, a mistake you made once and learned from. I'm sorry I couldn't be better. I'm sorry I took so much from you. I'm sorry I was too weak to face the consequences of my actions any way other than this. Marcus. Cassandra read the letter 3 times, trying to find something in it, closure, understanding, the final piece of the puzzle that would make everything make sense. It wasn't there. Marcus's motivations remained as opaque in death as they'd been in life, a muddle of jealousy, self-hatred, fear, and a desperate need to not be alone in his suffering. She thought about burning the letter, throwing it away, keeping it forever as evidence of the depth of human capacity for cruelty. In the end, she took it to her next therapy session and read it aloud, her voice steady, analyzing it like a text in a literature class rather than the final confession of the man who'd destroyed her life. "How does it make you feel?" Her therapist asked when Cassandra finished. "Sad," she said after a long pause. "Not for him, exactly, but for the whole situation. For everyone we could have been if we'd made different choices." "That's healthy," the therapist said. "Sadness without rage, regret without self-destruction. You're integrating the experience rather than being consumed by it." Cassandra nodded, folding the letter back into its envelope. She'd keep it, she decided. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of who she'd been, who she'd become, and the price paid by everyone involved when people chose selfishness over honesty. 2 years after her canceled wedding, Cassandra met someone. Lauren was a graphic designer she'd worked with on a photography project, and their first coffee as friends had turned into dinner, then drinks, then a kiss that had surprised them both. "I should tell you something," Cassandra said on their 3rd date, before things could progress further. "About my medical history." She laid it out plainly, the diagnosis, the treatment, the undetectable viral load that meant transmission was virtually impossible, but that some people still couldn't accept. Lauren listened without interrupting, her expression serious, but not afraid. "Thank you for telling me," she said when Cassandra finished. "And I hope you know that doesn't change how I see you, or whether I want to keep seeing you." Cassandra felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but blooming. The possibility of being fully known and still chosen. They took it slow. Cassandra's therapist warned her about rebound relationships, about using new love to paper over old trauma. But Lauren wasn't a rebound. She was patient and curious and had her own scars, her own history of betrayal and recovery. They were good together, careful with each other, honest in ways Cassandra had never managed with Daniel. 6 months into their relationship, Lauren asked about the canceled wedding, and Cassandra told her everything. The affair, Marcus's death, the year of therapy and depression, and slowly rebuilding herself into someone who could trust again. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if none of that had happened?" Lauren asked, tracing patterns on Cassandra's arm in the darkness of her bedroom. "Sometimes," Cassandra admitted. "But then I think about who I was before, how much I was pretending, how little I actually knew myself. And I realize that everything that happened, as terrible as it was, forced me to become real, to stop performing and start actually living." "So you're glad it happened?" "No." Cassandra turned to face her, their faces inches apart on the pillow. "I'm not glad. It was traumatic and horrible, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But I'm grateful for who I became on the other side of it. Does that make sense?" "Yeah." Lauren kissed her forehead. "It does." 3 years after her canceled wedding, Cassandra stood in an art gallery surrounded by her photographs. The exhibition was titled After, and it documented her journey through trauma, treatment, and recovery. Images of empty hotel rooms and sterile clinic spaces. Self-portraits that showed her face at various stages, numb, angry, broken, healing. Landscapes that gradually shifted from stark and barren to lush and alive. The centerpiece was a triptych, 3 photos of the same location, the garden venue where she was supposed to get married, taken 1 year apart. The first showed the space as it had been on her wedding day, chairs arranged in perfect rows, Edison bulbs unlit in the afternoon sun. The second showed it overgrown, abandoned, nature reclaiming the space. The third showed it renovated, hosting someone else's celebration, proof that spaces move on even when people can't. Daniel came to the opening. She hadn't invited him, but mutual friends had, and he'd shown up in a suit with Sarah on his arm, his face older but lighter somehow, like he'd finally put down a weight he'd been carrying. They stood in front of the triptych together, not speaking, just observing. "It's good," Daniel finally said. "The work. It's really good. Thank you." Cassandra glanced at Sarah, who was studying a different photograph with genuine interest. "I'm glad you came." "Me too." He turned to look at her directly for the first time since the parking lot conversation 2 years ago. "I'm proud of you. For doing this. For turning everything into something meaningful. I'm proud of you too." She nodded toward Sarah. "You look happy." "I am." He smiled, genuine and uncomplicated. Finally, they stood there a moment longer, 2 people who'd almost built a life together, acknowledging the space between who they'd been and who they'd become. "I forgive you," Daniel said quietly. "I don't know if you need to hear that, but I want you to know it's true." Cassandra felt tears prick her eyes, but they were clean tears, unencumbered by shame or desperation. "Thank you." "And Daniel?" "I forgive you too." "For what?" He looked genuinely confused. "For making me feel invisible, for working late every night and not noticing I was disappearing, for not being what I needed even though you thought you were." She took a breath. "We both failed each other. Maybe not as badly as I failed you, but we weren't right. Even before Marcus." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right. We weren't." Sarah rejoined them, slipping her hand into Daniel's, and Cassandra felt only warmth for them both. 2 people who'd found each other after their separate catastrophes, building something honest from the wreckage. Lauren appeared at her elbow, bringing wine and moral support, and they all stood together for a moment, the couples that were, that might have been, that had emerged from different fires. To survival, Lauren raised her glass. To honesty, Daniel added. To moving forward, Cassandra finished. They drank, and it tasted like closure. 5 years after her canceled wedding, Cassandra stood in another courtroom. Not as a witness this time, but as an advocate. Texas was considering legislation that would criminalize intentional HIV transmission, and Cassandra had been asked to testify about her experience, to put a face and story to the abstract legal concepts of bodily autonomy and informed consent. She'd debated for weeks before agreeing. Did she want to be defined by this forever? To be the HIV transmission victim rather than the photographer, the artist, the woman who'd rebuilt herself? But then she thought about other people, other Cassandras who might be sitting in clinic waiting rooms right now, learning their bodies had been betrayed, feeling alone and ashamed and like they'd somehow brought this on themselves. If her story could prevent that, could create legal consequences that might make someone think twice before making the choice Marcus had made, then it was worth reopening old wounds. The testimony was harder than she'd expected, harder than writing about it, harder than turning it into art. This required clinical precision, reliving specific dates and actions and conversations, while lawyers and legislators took notes and calculated political capital. But when it was done, when the bill passed with bipartisan support, Cassandra felt something shift, a sense of completion, of purpose extracted from pain. Marcus's cruelty had been transformed, not erased, never erased, but transmuted into something that might protect others. A law named for no one but understood by everyone who'd ever been violated by someone they trusted. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been Marcus facing consequences while alive, making amends, choosing honesty over cowardice. But it was something. A memorial built not from marble but from accountability. 7 years after her canceled wedding, Cassandra married Lauren. Small ceremony, close friends, no fanfare. They exchanged vows in a botanical garden at sunset, surrounded by the kind of wild, untamed beauty that couldn't be cultivated, only discovered. Rachel was her maid of honor. Daniel sent a card with his congratulations, a gesture that felt exactly right, acknowledgement without insertion, care without entanglement. Cassandra wore green instead of white because white felt like pretending, and she was done with pretense. When Lauren kissed her at the altar, Cassandra felt no ghosts, no echoes of weddings that hadn't happened. Just presence, gratitude, the profound gift of being fully known and still chosen. That night, lying in bed in the hotel where they'd celebrate before leaving for their honeymoon, Lauren asked the question Cassandra had been waiting for. "Do you ever think about him, Marcus?" Cassandra considered lying, offering the easy answer. But they'd built this relationship on honesty, on the hard work of being real, even when reality was uncomfortable. "Sometimes," she admitted, "not often anymore, but sometimes. Usually when I'm working on a new project or taking my medication or sitting in therapy, I think about how different my life would be if he'd made different choices. If we'd both made different choices. And I realize I can't regret something that led me here. To you, to this version of myself that I actually like. That feels authentic." She turned to face Lauren in the darkness. "Marcus tried to destroy me. And in some ways, he succeeded. The woman I was before him doesn't exist anymore. But the woman I became after? She's stronger, more honest, more capable of real love." So he failed. Lauren smiled. The destruction wasn't permanent. No. Cassandra smiled back. It wasn't. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that some stories have happy endings, even if they take years and tears and tremendous work to reach them. 10 years after her canceled wedding, Cassandra received a package. No return address, just her name and studio address written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a journal, Marcus's journal. She realized as she flipped through pages of his cramped handwriting, and a letter from Emily, his sister. "I found this while going through the last of Marcus's things. I've sat with it for years, debating whether to destroy it or send it to you. I've decided you should have it. Not because I think it will give you closure. I'm not sure closure is possible with something like this, but because it's yours. Your story is in these pages as much as his, and you deserve to know the full truth of what he was thinking, feeling, plotting. I hope you've found peace. I hope you've built a beautiful life, and I hope you know that what Marcus did was about his brokenness, not your worth. Emily." Cassandra should have thrown the journal away immediately, should have refused to give Marcus any more space in her head, her heart, her carefully reconstructed life. Instead, she read it, cover to cover, over 3 nights, Lauren sleeping peacefully beside her as Cassandra descended into the toxic psychology of the man who'd reshaped her life. It was worse than she'd imagined, and exactly what she'd expected in equal measure. Marcus had documented everything, his initial diagnosis, his rage and fear, his growing obsession with Cassandra and jealousy of Daniel. He'd planned the affair methodically, studied her weaknesses, calculated exactly what to say to make her feel special, desired, worth betraying her relationship for. But the pages also revealed his deterioration, the guilt that ate at him, the nights he'd sat with a bottle of pills, debating whether to confess or die, unable to do either. "She'll never forgive me. Daniel will never forgive me. I can't live with what I've done, but I can't face the consequences either. I'm trapped in a hell of my own making, and the only way out is through a door I don't have the courage to open." The final entry was dated 3 days before the wedding. "Tomorrow I'll make one last attempt to convince her not to tell. If that fails, I know what I have to do. I can't watch my life unravel. I can't face Daniel's eyes when he learns the truth. Better to be remembered as tragic than monstrous. Better to be dead than destroyed. I'm sorry. To everyone. To Cassandra, most of all. She deserved so much better than me." Cassandra closed the journal and sat in the darkness of her studio, processing the final piece of a puzzle she'd thought was already complete. Marcus hadn't killed himself in the moment, driven by immediate panic. He'd planned it, calculated it, chosen death as preferable to accountability with the same deliberate cruelty he'd chosen to infect her. She should have felt anger, rage at his cowardice, his self-pity, his inability to face consequences. Instead, she felt only sadness. Deep, oceanic sadness for everyone involved. For Marcus, trapped by his own toxicity. For Daniel, betrayed by his two closest people. For herself, carrying scars she'd never asked for. But beneath the sadness was something else. Something like gratitude. She was alive. She was healthy. She'd built a life rich with meaning and love and honest human connection. Marcus was dead, his potential forever frozen at the moment of his worst choices. She'd won. Not through revenge or justice or any satisfaction that came from his suffering, but simply by continuing. By refusing to let his cruelty define her permanently. By surviving and then transcending. That night, Cassandra gathered every piece of Marcus she'd accumulated, the letter, the journal, the old texts she'd screenshotted before deleting, and built a fire in the studio's small fireplace. Lauren found her there, feeding pages to the flames one by one, watching his words turn to ash. "Are you okay?" Lauren asked, settling beside her. "Yeah," and Cassandra realized it was true. "I'm letting it go, all of it. The anger, the sadness, the what-ifs. I'm choosing to be done carrying him." They sat together, watching the fire consume the last tangible evidence of Marcus Webb's presence in Cassandra's life. When the flames died down, Cassandra felt lighter, cleansed, ready. "Thank you," she said to Lauren, taking her hand. "For what?" "For loving me, despite everything. For being patient while I healed. For showing me what real partnership looks like." Lauren kissed her temple. "That's not something to thank me for. That's just what love does," and Cassandra understood finally what had been missing from her relationship with Daniel, what had never been possible with Marcus. This. Reciprocity. Safety. The profound gift of being met exactly where you are. The fire crackled down to embers, and Cassandra closed that chapter of her life, not with rage or triumph, but with quiet acceptance. Some stories don't have villains and heroes, just broken people making choices and living with consequences. Some wounds never fully heal, but they can transform into something else. Wisdom, resilience, the capacity for deeper empathy. And some nights, sitting beside someone who loves you not despite your past, but including it, you realize that survival itself is a kind of victory. Cassandra stood, pulling Lauren to her feet, ready to walk back into the life they'd built together. Behind her, the embers glowed one last time before fading to darkness. Ahead, the future waited, unknowable, full of possibility, entirely hers to shape. She chose forward, she chose life, she chose herself. The end. In the aftermath of trauma, we're told healing is linear, a straight path from pain to peace. But that's a lie. Healing is circular, contradictory, 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. It's learning to carry the weight of what happened without letting it crush you. It's discovering that you can hold space for anger and forgiveness, grief and gratitude, all at once. Cassandra's story doesn't end with justice or revenge or the satisfaction of Marcus getting what he deserved. It ends with something quieter and more powerful. A woman who refused to be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to her. Who transformed her trauma into art, her pain into purpose, her betrayal into the foundation for a more honest life. That's not a happy ending. That's a real one. And sometimes, that's enough.